Late summer light lay low across the plains, a honey glow that turned the wheat fields to slow-moving fire. The evening wind wandered through the stalks with the hush of a lullaby, carrying the dry scent of sage and a far-off coyote's solitary call. On the porch of a weathered waystation ranch, a single lantern swayed, its flame rising and bowing as though it breathed with the land. Clara Ellsworth sat there alone, skirts brushing the porch boards, the hem faintly dusty from her day's waiting. Her journey from Missouri had ended a week earlier than planned. The man who was to meet her had not. She had stepped from the stagecoach into a world of gold and silence, and no one had come forward with her name on his lips. A station hand offered her the spare room, said the ranch kept an open bunkhouse for travelers, and went back to his chores. Since then the days had lengthened, each morning bright and clean, each night slow to give up the heat, and she had remained, a quiet figure with a trunk, a bundle of letters, and an unspoken question resting in her chest. Every evening she wrote a line or two in a notebook she never meant to send. The scratch of her pen was softer than the breeze. Sometimes she wrote to the men whose proposal had brought her west, other times to no one at all. Words about the way the light slid across the porch rails, about the taste of the well water, about how the land felt both endless and intimate, as if it knew her already. She paused often, listening for the coyotes that began their thin song when the sky bruised to purple. From the barn came the measured sound of boots on packed dirt. Clara looked up to see a tall man guiding a lantern of his own, its glow spilling over a face cut by sun and quiet years. Elias Mercer, they had told her, was the cattle herder who kept the station's small herd and guarded its fences. He moved as though each step mattered, deliberate and steady, his shoulders carrying the calm weight of someone used to open country and long silences. He paused at the porch, tipping his hat in a gesture more courteous than words. "Evening," he said, voice deep as the horizon. "Evening," Clara answered, her own voice a little shy from disuse. "You write much," he observed, noticing the paper in her lap. "Helps a waiting," she replied, a faint smile tugging at her mouth. He nodded, the shadow of a smile flickering like the lantern between them. "Coffee's fresh if you'd like a cup." The invitation was simple, no expectation attached. She followed him inside to the modest kitchen where the kettle hissed softly. The air held the scent of roasted beans and dry timber. They drank in companionable quiet, watching the last line of sun fade behind the wheat. Later, when she stepped back onto the porch, another sound joined the evening chorus, the slow, tired hoofbeats of a horse approaching along the rutted trail. A stranger rode into view, his figure leaning with the weariness of miles. The lantern light caught a face browned by travel, eyes gentled by years of listening rather than speaking. "Good night to you," he greeted with a respectful nod. "Name's Jonah Pike. Mind if I water my mare and stretch a spell?" Elias gestured to the trough. "Plenty for all." Jonah dismounted, his saddlebag slung over one shoulder, the faint aroma of crushed herbs drifting from it. He was a healer, he explained, traveling between ranches and small towns with poultices and tinctures for those who had no doctor near. His manner carried the quiet assurance of someone who had seen pain and eased it without needing thanks. Clara offered him a seat and a share of the leftover cornbread. He accepted with a grateful smile and, noticing her stiff posture from long travel, asked if her feet pained her. When she admitted they did, he knelt without ceremony, mixing a small poultice from the contents of his bag. The cool paste smelled of mint and earth. His touch was professional, gentle, the kind that came from years of tending without judgment. They talked little. Jonah spoke of rivers that shimmered silver under moonlight and of children in distant settlements who laughed despite hardship. Clara found herself listening more to the cadence of his voice than the stories themselves, each word a soft thread in the night's tapestry. Elias listened too, leaning against a porch post, his gaze on the darkening horizon as if guarding them all. When dawn came, pale and clean, Jonah was already saddling his mare. He thanked them with a warm clasp of hands, wished Clara safe days ahead, and rode into the rising sun. His presence faded into the distance like a kindly ghost, leaving the air somehow deeper for the brief companionship. The day unfolded in its unhurried rhythm. Clara mended a tear in the porch screen, her fingers steady, each stitch a small act of belonging. Elias passed by carrying a coil of rope, pausing to watch her work. "Neat hand," he remarked, admiration soft in his tone. "Years of sewing," she answered, glancing up to find his eyes holding hers for a heartbeat longer than before. The breeze lifted the scent of cut hay, and somewhere a meadowlark sang its bright, looping song. They stood there a moment, two figures in the vastness, bound by nothing more than a shared quiet. As evening returned, Clara sat once more with her notebook. The lantern's glow wavered against the encroaching dusk. She wrote of small things, the way Elias moved among the cattle with wordless command, how the hills turned lavender when the sun slipped low, how a stranger's kindness could feel like a blessing. Her pen slowed, then stopped. She looked out across the golden plain where the light bled into shadow. Far off, beyond the rippling wheat, a solitary raider emerged, dark against the last smear of sun. The figure moved steadily, neither hurried nor hesitant, horse and rider blending with the deepening night until they became a single shape on the horizon. Clara held her breath, the stillness of her waiting stretching across the land. Sometimes, she thought, a heart waits so quietly the earth itself leans closer to listen. Morning light spilled like pale honey across the prairie, easing into the cracks of the porch where Clara sat tying her boots. Dew jeweled the grass, each drop catching the sun in a tiny flash. Elias emerged from a barn with a slow, deliberate stride, a length of rawhide rope coiled over one shoulder. He nodded in greeting, his eyes crinkling at the corners but his words few. The silence between them had become companionable, a low hum beneath the day's work. They began with the wagon wheel. A storm weeks back had cracked one of the spokes, and Elias set the rim on a block while Clara steadied the axle. The smell of fresh sawn pine rose each time he trimmed a new piece. They worked without hurry, the only sounds the rasp of the file and the occasional call of a meadowlark. When the final peg slid into place, Elias gave the wheel a slow spin. It turned smooth and true. Clara felt a quiet pride bloom in her chest, as if the wheel itself confirmed she belonged here, at least for now. Chores wove the hours together. Chickens needed grain, the garden wanted weeding, the cornbread dough had to be mixed before noon heat. Elias fetched water from the well while Clara kneaded flour and lard into a soft mound, the rhythm of her hands matching the soft thud of his boots on packed earth. At the rough-hewn table they ate in easy silence, crumbs scattering like small stars across the boards. Conversation came in small offerings, the scent of rain on the western wind, the stubbornness of a young steer, the best trail to reach the next settlement before sundown. Each word mattered because so few were spoken. One evening the sky stretched clear and deep, a velvet sweep of darkness scattered with silver. Clara leaned on the porch rail, her shawl pulled tight against a sudden chill. Without a word, Elias draped a worn wool coat over her shoulders, the fabric carrying the faint scent of cedar and smoke. Overhead, a meteor flared and vanished, then another, until the heavens seemed to breathe fire. They watched together, not needing speech, the vastness around them shrinking to the quiet space they shared. Another night he led her beyond the fence line to listen to the wild. They stood in knee-high grass while the moon painted the hills in soft pewter. A high, trembling cry rose from a distance. "Coyote," Elias murmured, tilting his head. Moments later a deeper, steadier howl followed. "That's a wolf. Hear how it carries low, like the ground itself is singing." Clara closed her eyes and heard it, the difference between hunger and dominion, between a scavenger's plea and a hunter's claim. The lesson settled into her bones as naturally as breathing. Days passed, and she began to see the quiet care he gave every creature under his watch. He moved among the cattle without whip or shout, guiding with a gentle gesture, a low whistle. The animals responded to him as though they trusted the calm in his blood. Watching him, Clara felt an ache she couldn't name, something close to admiration and something deeper that lived between heartbeats. In the slow hours after dusk, memories drifted in like smoke. Clara thought of her parents, long gone, of the cold Missouri winters when she warmed her hands by a fire that belonged to no one but herself. Loneliness had pushed her toward a stranger's proposal, but beneath that choice was a longing for something steadier than letters and dreams. She wondered if that longing had been answered in a way she had not expected. Elias carried his own shadows. One afternoon, while mending a fence line, he spoke quietly of a distant skirmish, a dispute over land when he was barely more than a boy. He told how tempers had flared and rifles had been drawn, and how he'd stood firm, refusing to fire. His calm had spread like water on a flame until the men lowered their guns. "Sometimes doing nothing is the hardest work," he said, eyes fixed on the far horizon. Clara heard the weight behind the words and knew that the steadiness she admired had been forged in that moment. The rhythm of their days felt as natural as the sun's path, until the noon stagecoach brought a change carried in a single envelope. The driver handed it to her with a nod, dust swirling around his boots. Clara's breath caught at the sight of the familiar scrawl. She turned the letter over in her hands, the paper creased and travel-worn, the ink blotched as if the writer's grip had faltered. For a long moment she simply held it, the world narrowing to the thin weight of promises delayed. She broke the seal with careful fingers. The words inside wavered, some blurred by what might have been rain or tears. The men who had once asked her to be his bride wrote of illness and unexpected delays, of hopes that she would wait. There was no certain plan, only a plea for patience and the echo of affection that felt more like memory than present love. She read it twice, each line quieter than the last. Elias found her on the porch, the letter folded against her palm. He didn't intrude, only leaned against the post, the evening light catching the quiet strength at his face. "Bad news?" he asked softly. "Not bad," she said after a moment. "Not good either. Just distant." He nodded, understanding more than she could explain. The wind lifted a strand of her hair, and he reached out as if to smooth it but stopped just short, a gesture that said everything and nothing. The silence between them thickened, not awkward but full, like the pause before a slow song. Later, as the sun slid behind the hills, Clara folded the letter again and slipped it into her notebook. She felt no anger, only a deep stillness, as if the prairie itself had paused to consider her choice. Some promises, she thought, travel slower than the wind, yet somehow find the porch where they belong. Night settled with the softness of worn velvet. From the dark edge of the plain, coyotes called and were answered by the low, mournful echo of a lone wolf. Clara stood listening, the battered envelope warm against her chest, unsure whether to wait for the men who had written it, to leave for a future uncertain, or to trust the life already taking quiet root beside her. The lantern flame flickered in the gentle breeze, and she felt the world lean close, listening for her next breath. The evening sun sagged low, spilling copper light across the prairie until every blade of grass seemed edged in fire. Clara was gathering the day's wash from the line when the distant thud of hooves reached her ears, steady, unhurried, a rhythm that carried intent. She straightened, the clothes still damp in her arms, and watched a lone rider crest a far hill. Dust curled behind him like a faded banner. Elias stepped from the barn before she could call his name. He'd heard it too, the quiet warning stitched into that approaching cadence. His posture remained calm, but a subtle tension settled in his shoulders, as if he were bracing for an old echo. Clara set the basket down and stood near the porch rail, heart quickening in the hush that followed. The rider came on, a tall man draped in a trail-worn coat the color of storm clouds. He dismounted with deliberate grace, tying his horse to the post with a single practiced knot. Sunlight caught the brass of a deputy's badge half hidden beneath the coat's flap. His face held no threat, only the weathered patience of someone who'd ridden far on a promise. "Evening," he said, voice low but firm. "Name's Calder. I'm looking for a man might go by Elias Mercer now. Used to answer to Eli March, rode with the Hawthorne gang near 10 years back. Heard he might be working cattle out this way." Clara felt the world narrow. She turned to Elias, searching his face for denial, but found only a quiet acceptance, as if the name Calder spoke had been waiting in the dusk all along. "That was a lifetime ago," Elias replied, the words measured, even. "I reckon you came a long ride to ask a question I won't hide from." Calder studied him, eyes narrowing not in suspicion but in careful reading. "You admitting you were with him?" "For one season," Elias said. "A reckless summer when I thought the fastest horse could outrun the men I meant to be. I left before any blood was spilled. Didn't take a cent that wasn't mine to earn." He rested a hand on the porch post, the gesture steady, unflinching. "I never raised a gun in their name, and I never will." The prairie wind stirred, carrying the scent of sage and cooling earth. Clara held her breath, feeling the weight of past and present balance on the edge of silence. Calder shifted, the leather of his coat creaking softly. "I've chased ghosts across these hills," the bounty hunter said at last. "Most men run, even from the memory of what they were. You don't look like a man who's running." "I'm not," Elias answered. "I've got work, cattle, fences to mend. That's all the law I need." Calder's gaze softened, a hint of respect in its depths. He glanced at Clara, who met his eyes with a quiet steadiness she hadn't known she possessed. The bounty hunter exhaled, long and slow, then touched the brim of his hat. "Reckon the wind already judged you," he said. "Justice sometimes means knowing when a man has already paid his debt to the wind." With a final nod, he mounted his horse and rode back into the deepening twilight, his silhouette folding into the horizon until it was only another line of shadow. The yard settled into stillness again, the only sound the low murmur of cattle beyond the fence. Clara felt her heartbeat return to a gentle rhythm. Elias remained by the porch post, watching the last smear of sun fade behind the hills. "You could have denied it," she said softly. "No sense in lies," he replied. "Past is a trail you can't burn. It always leaves a mark, even if the grass grows over." She stepped closer, the letter from her suitor still hidden in the pocket of her skirt. Its presence felt heavier now, as if the ink inside carried not a promise but a question. "Does it haunt you?" she asked. Elias shook his head, eyes on the horizon. "It taught me. That's different." They stayed that way for a while, side by side in the cooling air, the first stars winking awake above them. The quiet stretched, but it was not empty. Claire reached into her pocket, fingertips brushing the worn paper. She thought of the men who had written it, of the uncertain words and the miles of silence between them. She thought of the steadiness beside her, the men who had stood unarmed before judgment and remained unshaken. When she finally spoke, her voice was a whisper meant more for the night than for him. "I don't know if the one who wrote this letter will ever come." Elias turned, his gaze gentle. "You don't owe me your choice. And you don't ask for it," she said, almost to herself. "I won't." The stars deepened, scattering silver across the dark bowl of sky. A coyote's cry floated from the distant hills, answered by another farther off. The sound was lonely yet full, like a hymn carried by the wind. Clara let the night seep into her, feeling the weight of past and possibility settle in equal measure. They spoke little after that, words replaced by the easy rhythm of breathing and the quiet chorus of insects in the grass. Clara sensed the shape of her life shifting, not with sudden revelation but with the slow certainty of a river finding its course. Beside her, Elias remained still, offering nothing but the space where she might choose to stand. As the horizon softened toward dawn, a pale wash of light touched the porch. Clara stayed beside him, the letter unopened again, the decision unwritten. The world felt balanced on a breath, as if morning itself waited for her heart to speak. Elias asked nothing. He simply kept his quiet vigil, a steady presence against the vast, forgiving sky.